The screech of tires shattered the stillness of the quiet neighborhood, echoing through the empty streets like a warning. It wasn't the kind of sound that belonged here. Here, where time seemed to have frozen and the ghosts of the past lingered in the shadows of palm trees. For decades, Section 14 had been a silent wound, an untold story buried beneath the surface of a thriving city. But tonight, the silence was breaking. In the dim glow of a street lamp, Gloria Martinez sat alone on the bench she had visited every evening for as long as she could remember. She clutched a worn, yellowed photograph in her trembling hands, the edges frayed from decades of being folded and unfolded. It was a picture of her childhood home, a home that no longer existed, demolished in the dead of night without a warning or a shred of mercy. The image haunted her, not just for what it represented, but for what it had cost her family. Her gaze lifted to the horizon as the wind carried with it the faint echo of laughter from a nearby community center. Tonight was different. Tonight, the whispers of the past were loud enough to stir an entire city. The mayor had called for a meeting, a rare gathering of city officials, descendants, activists, and historians. For years, the history of Section 14 had been swept under the rug, labeled as progress by those who had benefited from it, and as betrayal by those who had suffered because of it. But now, with growing calls for justice and the mounting voices of a community demanding answers, the city could no longer turn a blind eye. Inside the packed hall, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. People were seated shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mixture of anger, pain, and determination. At the center of it all stood Marcus Grant, a man whose calm but fiery presence commanded the room. Marcus, a descendant of Section 14, had spent years uncovering the truth behind his grandparents' displacement. He had unearthed documents, photographs, and testimonies that painted a chilling picture of greed, racism, and systemic erasure. As Marcus stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. His voice, steady but laced with emotion, cut through the tension like a blade. "They said it was progress," he began, his words heavy with sarcasm. "They said it was necessary, but let me ask you this. When does progress come at the cost of destroying families? When does progress justify burning homes to the ground? Because that's what happened in Section 14. The crowd stirred, murmurs of agreement rippling through the room. Gloria, seated in the back, felt her heart pound in her chest. She clutched the photograph tighter, as if holding onto it might anchor her to the moment. Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. Section 14 wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a community, a thriving, vibrant community of hardworking Black and Mexican American families. Families who built their lives from nothing, only to have it all taken away. And for what? For luxury resorts? For golf courses? For the convenience of those who didn't want to see people like us? The room erupted in applause, a cathartic release of anger and solidarity. But Marcus raised his hand, signaling for silence. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the mayor, who sat stiffly in the front row, his face pale and drawn. "The city knew," Marcus said, his tone sharper now. "They knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't just displace us. They erased us. And tonight, we're here to make sure that never happens again." As he spoke, David Sullivan, a local historian, scribbled notes furiously in his journal. David had spent years piecing together the fragmented history of Section 14, but even he was unprepared for the raw emotion of the testimonies being shared tonight. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on a young woman seated near the wall, her hood pulled low over her face. She seemed out of place, yet entirely focused, her eyes fixed on Marcus as though his words were the answer to a question she had been asking her entire life. The testimonies that followed were gut-wrenching. An elderly man spoke of watching his home burn to the ground, the flames reflected in his children's terrified eyes. A woman described the years of poverty her family endured after being forcibly evicted, their savings wiped out overnight. Each story was a reminder of the human cost of greed and discrimination, but amidst the pain there was a flicker of hope. Marcus's passion was infectious, his words lighting a fire in the hearts of those who had come seeking justice. "We will not be ignored," he declared, his voice rising above the applause. "We will not be silenced, and we will not stop until the truth is known and justice is served." As the meeting adjourned, Gloria approached Marcus, her photograph clutched tightly in her hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling, "for speaking for us, for giving us hope." Marcus smiled, his expression softening. "This is just the beginning," he replied. "The fight isn't over yet." Outside, David caught up with the young woman he had noticed earlier. "Excuse me," he said, his tone cautious but curious. "I couldn't help but notice you seemed deeply invested in tonight's discussion. Are you connected to Section 14? The woman hesitated, her gaze flickering between David and the street behind him. "Let's just say I have a personal stake in this," she replied cryptically, before disappearing into the night. David watched her go, his curiosity piqued. Who was she, and what role did she play in this unfolding story? He didn't know it yet, but the answers to those questions would soon lead him down a path he never expected. A path that would uncover even darker truths about Section 14 and the people who had orchestrated its destruction. The echoes of the past were growing louder, and with them came a question that no one in Palm Springs could ignore. What happens when the truth refuses to stay buried? As the cool night breeze swept through the city, Marcus Grant sat at his desk, surrounded by piles of old documents and faded photographs. The weight of the evening's meeting lingered heavily on him. He sifted through the yellowed pages, his eyes scanning decades-old eviction notices and city council minutes that detailed the so-called redevelopment plan for Section 14. The words on the pages were clinical, devoid of emotion, just cold, calculated decisions that had destroyed lives. He couldn't help but feel the anger bubbling beneath his calm exterior. It wasn't just about the past, it was about the city's refusal to take accountability, even now, all these years later. The next morning, the city's media outlets were abuzz with coverage of the community meeting. Local news channels ran segments highlighting the testimonies from displaced families, and social media was flooded with clips of Marcus's fiery speech. The hashtag Justice for Section 14 began trending, drawing attention from across the country. Marcus knew this momentum was crucial. He had spent years trying to get people to listen, and now, for the first time, it felt like the world was paying attention. But not everyone was thrilled about the growing spotlight on Section 14. In a sleek, high-rise office building downtown, a group of city officials gathered for an emergency meeting. The mayor sat at the head of the table, his face tense as he listened to the heated discussion unfolding around him. "This is getting out of hand," one council member said, slamming a folder onto the table. "Do you have any idea how bad this makes us look? If this keeps gaining traction, we could be facing lawsuits." A shout, reparations even. Another official chimed in, his voice low and wary. "We need to control the narrative before it spirals out of our hands. If people start digging too deep, they might uncover things we can't explain away." The mayor raised a hand, silencing the room. "Let's be clear," he said, his tone sharp. "We're not here to rehash the past. What's done is done. Our job is to protect the city's image and keep this situation contained. If that means making some concessions, so be it. But we will not let this derail everything we've built." Back in the heart of the city, Marcus met with a small group of activists and historians at a local cafe. Among them was David Sullivan, who had spent the past few days poring over his research, trying to connect the dots between the city's actions and the larger forces at play. Back in the heart of the city, Marcus met with a small group of activists and historians about who benefited from them. Look at this. Marcus opened the folder, his eyes narrowing as he read the documents inside. They were records of land transactions, showing how the properties in Section 14 had been sold at rock-bottom prices to developers with ties to powerful city officials. It wasn't just greed, it was corruption on a massive scale. "This isn't just about redevelopment," Marcus said, his voice grim. "This was a coordinated effort to erase an entire community for profit." One of the activists, a young woman named Alicia, spoke up. "If we can prove this, it changes everything. It's not just about reparations, it's about exposing the truth and holding people accountable." But Marcus knew that exposing the truth wouldn't be easy. The people they were up against had deep pockets and powerful connections. He glanced at the photograph Gloria had given him after the meeting, a picture of her childhood home, now replaced by a luxury resort. It was a stark reminder of what they were fighting for. Meanwhile, Gloria herself was grappling with her own emotions. After decades of silence, she found herself flooded with memories of Section 14, the smell of her mother's cooking, the sound of children playing in the streets, the warmth of a community that had been her entire world. She had spent years trying to forget the pain of losing it all, but now those memories were resurfacing, sharper than ever. Sitting in her small apartment, Gloria pulled out a shoebox filled with keepsakes from her past. Inside were letters, photographs, and a faded newspaper clipping about the evictions. She hadn't looked at these items in years, but now she felt compelled to share her story. She picked up the phone and called Marcus. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice firm. "It's time." The next day, Marcus visited Gloria at her apartment. She laid the shoebox on the table and began pulling out its contents, her hands trembling slightly. "This is all I have left of Section 14, she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "They took everything else." As Marcus examined the items, he felt a surge of determination. These weren't just keepsakes. They were evidence. Evidence of a community that had thrived before it was torn apart. Evidence that could help them piece together the full story of what had happened. But as Marcus and Gloria worked to uncover the truth, forces were already moving against them. In the shadows, those who had profited from the destruction of Section 14 were beginning to feel the pressure. Anonymous threats began trickling in, emails warning Marcus to stop digging and cryptic messages left on Gloria's voicemail. It was clear that someone wanted them to stay silent. Undeterred, Marcus pressed forward. He reached out to national media outlets, sharing the story of Section 14 and the fight for justice. He knew that the more attention they could bring to the issue, the harder it would be for their opponents to silence them. As the story gained traction, more descendants of Section 14 came forward, sharing their own accounts of displacement and loss. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, painting a vivid picture of a community that had been systematically erased. The momentum was building, and with it came a renewed sense of hope. But Marcus also knew that hope wasn't enough. They needed action, they needed accountability, and, most of all, they needed justice. As he stood in the park where Section 14 had once thrived, he looked out at the city skyline and vowed to see this fight through to the end. The growing movement for justice had gained undeniable traction, but with every step forward, the stakes grew higher. Marcus Grant could feel the pressure mounting, not just from the community that depended on him, but also from the forces working tirelessly to stop him. Each day brought new challenges, both seen and unseen, and the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him. One afternoon, Marcus received a call from Alicia, the young activist who had been working alongside him. Her voice was urgent, filled with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Marcus, you need to come to the library," she said. "David and I found something big." When Marcus arrived, he was greeted by David, who looked both energized and nervous. In his hands was a thick manila folder, the edges worn from being handled repeatedly. "Marcus, you're not going to believe this," David said, spreading out the contents on the table. "We've been digging through old archives and land records, and we found something damning." The documents showed a clear paper trail, linking key city officials to the developers who had swooped in to buy the Section 14 properties for pennies on the dollar. Bank transfers, confidential memos, and even handwritten notes painted a vivid picture of collusion and corruption. But the most shocking piece was a memo from decades ago, signed by a high-ranking city official, outlining the intent to redevelop Section 14 by any means necessary, including the forced removal of its residents. "This wasn't just a development plan," Alicia said, her voice shaking with anger. "This was an orchestrated land grab. They targeted Section 14 because they saw the residents as expendable, as obstacles to their profits." Marcus stared at the documents, his mind racing. This was more than he had hoped to find, proof not only of negligence, but of a calculated, deliberate effort to erase a community. He knew this information could be a game changer, but he also knew it would make them even bigger targets. As they discussed their next steps, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was chilling. "You're playing with fire. Stop now before you get burned." Marcus showed the message to Alicia and David, his jaw tightening. "They're scared," he said, "and that means we're on the right track."
Despite the threat, Marcus decided to go public with the evidence. He arranged a press conference at the community center, inviting local and national media to hear what they had uncovered. The room was packed, with reporters jostling for position and cameras flashing incessantly. Gloria sat in the front row, her presence a silent but powerful reminder of what was at stake. As Marcus stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He began by recounting the history of Section 14, painting a vivid picture of the vibrant community it had once been. Then, with a steady voice, he unveiled the documents, walking the audience through the evidence of corruption and collusion. Each detail landed like a blow, the weight of the revelations palpable in the room. "This isn't just a story about the past," Marcus said, his voice firm. "It's a story about accountability, about justice, and about the future we want to build, not just for the descendants of Section 14, but for every community that has been marginalized and erased." The press conference was a turning point. The story made national headlines, sparking widespread outrage and calls for action. Politicians were forced to address the issue, with some expressing support for reparations and others scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. The hashtag Justice for Section 14 trended for days, and donations poured in to support the fight for justice. But the backlash was swift. Marcus began receiving more threats, some veiled and others explicit. Anonymous emails warned him to back off, and his car was vandalized outside his home. Gloria also found herself targeted, with strangers leaving hostile messages on her doorstep. The intimidation tactics were meant to scare them into silence, but they only strengthened their resolve. One evening, as Marcus sat in his living room, his phone rang. It was a call from a journalist with a major news outlet. "Mr. Grant, I've been following your work on Section 14, the journalist said. "I have a source who claims to have inside knowledge about the city's actions. They're willing to talk, but only if they can remain anonymous." The next day, Marcus met the source in a quiet corner of a coffee shop. The man was older, with a weathered face and a nervous demeanor. "I worked for the city back then," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw what they were doing, but I was just a small cog in a big machine. I didn't have the power to stop it." The man went on to describe the meetings where decisions were made, the pressure to push through the redevelopment plan, and the threats against anyone who dared to speak out. They didn't care about the people of Section 14, he said, his voice heavy with regret. To them, it was just business, profit over people. Marcus listened intently, recording every word. This was the kind of first-hand testimony that could add a human element to the evidence they had gathered. It was a powerful reminder that, while the actions of the city were monstrous, there were individuals within the system who had wrestled with their conscience, even if they ultimately stayed silent. As Marcus prepared to leave, the man grabbed his arm. "Be careful," he said, his eyes filled with fear. "They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves."
The warning stayed with Marcus as he continued to push forward. He knew the fight for justice would come at a cost, but he also knew that the stakes were too high to back down. The people of Section 14 had already paid the ultimate price, losing their homes, their community, and their history. Marcus was determined to ensure that their stories would not be silenced. Meanwhile, Gloria found herself reflecting on the journey she had embarked on. She had spent so many years burying the pain of Section 14, trying to move on and forget. But now, as she saw the movement gaining momentum, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She began speaking at events, sharing her story with audiences that included everyone from high school students to lawmakers. Each time she told her story, she felt a little stronger, a little more at peace with the past. The movement for justice continued to grow, drawing support from unexpected places. Celebrities, activists, and even some politicians began to rally around the cause, using their platforms to amplify the story of Section 14. But with the increased visibility came increased scrutiny, and Marcus knew they had to stay vigilant. As the weeks went on, the city council announced a special hearing to address the issue of Section 14. It was a chance for the community to speak directly to those in power, to demand accountability and reparations. The hearing was scheduled to take place in the city's Grand Municipal Hall, a stark contrast to the modest homes and tight-knit streets that had once defined Section 14. The night before the hearing, Marcus stood on the site where Section 14 had once thrived. The luxury resorts and high-end shops that now occupied the land were a painful reminder of what had been lost. But as he looked out at the glittering skyline, he felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about the past, it was about building a future where such injustices could never happen again. The city council hearing was set to be a pivotal moment, a stage where decades of pain and resilience would finally take center stage. As Marcus, Gloria, and a coalition of Section 14 descendants entered the Grand Municipal Hall, they were greeted by an overwhelming crowd. Some came to support the cause, others out of curiosity, and a few with skepticism. The room buzzed with anticipation, the air thick with tension and hope. The council members sat on an elevated platform, their expressions varying from indifference to unease. Marcus noticed some of them exchanging glances, whispering among themselves. He wondered how many were genuinely invested in justice, and how many were simply hoping to weather the storm until the public outrage subsided. Gloria took her seat in the front row, clutching a worn photo of her family outside their old Section 14 home. The image was a stark reminder of what they had lost, but also of what they were fighting for. As the hearing began, a council member cleared his throat and addressed the room. "We are here to listen to the grievances of the community regarding Section 14 and to determine the path forward," he said, his tone bureaucratic and detached. "We will hear testimonies, review evidence, and deliberate on potential resolutions." Marcus's heart raced as the first speaker took the stand. It was an elderly man named Harold, one of the few surviving original residents of Section 14. He walked slowly, leaning on a cane, but his voice was steady and strong. "I was just a boy when they came for us," he began, his eyes scanning the room. "They called it progress. They said it was for the greater good. But for my family, it was the end of everything we knew." Harold described the day his family was evicted, the tears in his mother's eyes as she begged for more time, the way their belongings were thrown onto the street like garbage. We weren't just losing our homes, he said, his voice cracking. We were losing our sense of belonging, our community, our history. His words hung in the air, a poignant reminder of the human cost of the city's actions. As one testimony followed another, the stories painted a vivid picture of a thriving community torn apart. A former teacher spoke of the neighborhood school where children once played and learned, now replaced by a parking lot. A local historian detailed the cultural significance of Section 14, describing it as a beacon of hope for marginalized communities. Each story was a piece of the puzzle, adding depth and nuance to the fight for justice. When it was Gloria's turn to speak, she stood tall, her hands gripping the photo tightly. My family was one of many who called Section 14 home, she began, her voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside her. We weren't just residents. We were a community. We looked out for each other, celebrated together, mourned together. And then, one day, it was all taken away. She recounted the eviction, the fear and confusion as city officials arrived unannounced, the sound of bulldozers in the distance as they tore through homes. We were treated like we didn't matter, like our lives were disposable, she said, her voice rising. But we did matter, and we still do. That's why we're here today, to make sure the world knows what happened, to demand accountability, and to ensure this never happens again. Gloria's words were met with a standing ovation, the crowd moved by her courage and resilience. Even some of the council members appeared visibly affected, their professional facades cracking under the weight of the testimonies. Marcus felt a surge of pride as he watched Gloria take her seat, her head held high. When it was Marcus's turn, he approached the podium with a folder in hand, the evidence they had painstakingly gathered. What you've heard today are not just stories. They are truths, he began, his voice firm, and these truths are backed by evidence. He laid out the documents, presenting them one by one, the memos detailing the city's plans, the financial records linking officials to developers, the testimony from the former city employee. Each piece was a nail in the coffin of the city's narrative. This wasn't progress, Marcus said, his voice filled with conviction. This was theft. Theft of land, of livelihoods, of dignity. And it wasn't just a mistake, it was intentional, calculated, and devastating. The room was silent as Marcus concluded his presentation. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions ranging from defensive to reflective. The mayor, who had been conspicuously quiet throughout the hearing, finally spoke. Mr. Grant, Miss Hughes, and everyone who has shared their stories today, I want to acknowledge the pain and injustice you have endured, he said, his tone cautious. The council will take your testimonies and evidence into consideration as we deliberate on next steps. The response was met with a mix of applause and skepticism. Many in the room, including Marcus, knew that words were not enough. They needed action, real, tangible action that addressed the harm done and provided a path toward restitution. As the hearing adjourned, Marcus and Gloria were approached by reporters eager for interviews. They spoke about the importance of the movement, the strength of the community, and the need for systemic change. The coverage further amplified their cause, drawing attention from national figures and organizations who offered their support. But the fight was far from over. Behind closed doors, the council's deliberations were fraught with tension. Some members argued for reparations, citing the overwhelming evidence and public pressure. Others resisted, fearing the financial and political implications. The debate raged on, with no clear resolution in sight. Meanwhile, Marcus and Gloria continued their work, organizing community meetings, rallying support, and keeping the momentum alive. They knew that justice would not come easily, but they also knew that they had come too far to back down now. One evening, as Marcus was preparing for another meeting, he received a call from an unexpected ally, a prominent lawyer who had been following the case. Mr. Grant, I believe we can take this fight to the next level, the lawyer said. If the city council fails to act, we can pursue legal action. I'm willing to represent the Section 14 descendants pro bono. The offer was a game changer, providing a new avenue for justice if the council failed to deliver. Marcus shared the news with Gloria and the rest of the team, their determination reignited. They knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but they also knew that they were no longer alone. The movement for justice had grown into something bigger than any one person. It was a collective force, driven by the unwavering belief that change was not only possible but necessary. The council's decision was looming, and the pressure was at an all-time high. The city was abuzz with debate. News outlets dissected every testimony, community leaders took to social media to amplify the movement, and the public, galvanized by the stories of Section 14 descendants, demanded accountability. Protests grew in size, with people from all walks of life joining the fight. Signs reading, "Justice for Section 14" and "Our History Matters" were raised high as the chants echoed through the streets. Gloria, Marcus, and their team worked tirelessly in the days leading up to the announcement. They organized rallies, met with allies, and continued to gather support from influential figures. Celebrities, activists, and even politicians began to weigh in, bringing national attention to their cause. Every step forward felt like a small victory, but the uncertainty of the council's decision loomed like a dark cloud. On the morning of the announcement, the city council chamber was packed to capacity. People spilled out into the hallways, and those who couldn't get inside gathered outside, watching the proceedings on large screens. The tension was palpable. Gloria sat beside Marcus, her hands clenched tightly around the edges of her chair. She could feel the weight of her family's legacy, of every story they had shared, pressing down on her. This was the moment they had fought so hard for. The mayor called the meeting to order, his face grim as he addressed the room. Over the past weeks, we have heard the testimonies of those affected by the events in Section 14, he began. We have reviewed the evidence, deliberated extensively, and considered the best path forward. Marcus exchanged a glance with Gloria, their hearts pounding in unison. The council's decision could either validate their struggle or crush the hopes of an entire community. The room fell silent as the mayor continued. It is clear that what happened in Section 14 was a grave injustice, he said, his tone measured. The city failed its residents, and that failure has caused lasting harm. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of relief and anticipation, but as the mayor continued, it became clear that the decision was far from straightforward. While we acknowledge this injustice, the question remains, how do we address it in a way that is both meaningful and sustainable? The council members took turns outlining their proposed resolutions. Some advocated for financial reparations, suggesting a fund to support the descendants of Section 14. Others proposed symbolic gestures, such as public apologies and memorials to honor the lost community. But as the discussion unfolded, it became clear that not everyone was on the same page. Certain council members expressed concerns about the financial burden, arguing that the city's budget could not support such reparations. Gloria felt her stomach churn as she listened to the arguments against reparations. It was a painful reminder of the obstacles they still faced, of the systemic inequities that had allowed this injustice to persist for so long. Marcus clenched his fists, his frustration mounting as he watched some council members prioritize financial concerns over moral responsibility. When the mayor opened the floor for public comment, Gloria stood up, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. I understand that this decision isn't easy, she began, but what happened to Section 14 wasn't just a mistake. It was a violation of our humanity. My family, like so many others, lost everything because of the city's actions. This isn't just about money. It's about accountability, about recognizing the harm that was done and taking meaningful steps to make it right. Her words were met with applause, but the tension in the room remained. Marcus followed, presenting a clear and compelling case for reparations. We're not asking for a handout, he said, his voice firm. "We're asking for justice. For decades, our community has carried the burden of this injustice while the city profited. It's time to do what's right." As the public comments concluded, the mayor called for a vote. The room held its collective breath as the council members cast their ballots. Each vote felt like an eternity, the tension so thick it was almost unbearable. When the final vote was tallied, the mayor announced the decision. The council had approved a reparations fund for the descendants of Section 14. The room erupted in applause and cheers, the weight of the moment washing over everyone. Gloria hugged Marcus tightly, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "We did it." For the first time in years, she felt a sense of hope, a belief that justice was not just an ideal, but a tangible reality. But even in their victory, Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. The Reparations Fund was a monumental step forward, but it was only the beginning. They still had to ensure that the funds were distributed fairly, that the city followed through on its promises, and that the story of Section 14 was never forgotten. In the weeks that followed, the community came together to celebrate their victory. Events were held to honor the survivors and descendants, to share stories, and to rebuild the connections that had been severed so long ago. Gloria and Marcus became leaders in the movement, using their platform to advocate for broader change and to ensure that other communities facing similar injustices could find hope in their story. One evening, as Gloria stood in front of a crowd at a community event, she held up the photo of her family that she had carried throughout their journey. "This isn't just a picture," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "It's a reminder of what we've lost, but also of what we've gained." Section 14 was more than just a neighborhood. It was a symbol of resilience, of community, of hope. And today, we honor that legacy by continuing to fight for justice. The crowd erupted in applause, their voices echoing into the night. Marcus watched from the sidelines, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He knew that their journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt that they were on the right path, a path toward healing, toward accountability, and toward a future where the stories of Section 14 would inspire generations to come.